Hello, and welcome to Based on Facts, where fiction and superstition meet logic and scientific facts on WELT 95.7 FM, broadcasting from the Allen County Public Library. My name is Chris Rex, and today we're going to be talking about Thanksgiving because, well, that just kind of happened last week, actually. In this particular case, what I want to name this episode is Thanks for Giving Us the Oil Pipeline. Because of the fact it's kind of neat that we're able to celebrate this, annual holiday, Thanksgiving, but at the same time, we're also having this huge protest going on about this oil pipeline in North Dakota. And so I kind of want to talk about both those things because they both kind of talk about Native Americans and their roles in America right now and what's going on with them along the way. So first off, I want to talk about Thanksgiving because, just enjoyed a great meal with family members and being able to sit down and gorge yourself for an entire day is not everything you get to do every single week, especially around great company, at least hopefully great company in the form of your family members and friends. So, I had a great time. It's normally a great time for most people around this time of year. So let's talk about a little bit of the history of it. Alright. Now, classically speaking, people know that the first Thanksgiving was some random event in the past between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. And this really happened shortly after Pilgrims settling in North America and starting to form colonies and starting to interact with the natives, which were Native Americans. By the way, for those of you who don't know, Native Americans, they didn't come over and settle North America from ships, okay? From ships from Western civilization, okay? Which is to say, they did not come from Europe, they did not come from Scandinavia, did not come from Africa. Alright, the Native Americans actually came over into America through the same route that a number of large mammals did, which was through the Bering Strait Sea Bridge, or land bridge as it would be. Which is to say, they basically came from Russia over into Alaska. Well, that particular channel was actually above the water level. And so that's how the mammals got here. Humans, being the creatures that they are, or at least were back then, very much hunter-gatherer types, and so they would be nomadic and would actually follow the herds of mammals during their migrations. And so humans actually migrated to North America via the same way that ancient bison did, the woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, all those sorts of things kind of migrated through that strait into North America. So that's why when you look at Native Americans and try to analyze their ancestry and genetics, you find that they're actually much more closely related to Chinese people than they are to, say, Middle Eastern people, okay? Because they were descendants from the Chinese and Russian populations over there. So, kind of interesting to look at least from a genetic perspective. Anyway, getting back on topic, we have about 1620 being the date upon which we had 100 or so pilgrims enter the New World after being at sea for 66 days, crossing this treacherous body of water between England and, where the United States is now. And they made this journey because they were trying to carve out a lifestyle in Plymouth, England, that wasn't necessarily smiled upon, right? And they desired freedom to practice their own religion in their own particular way, so much so that they were willing to risk their lives and put their lives on the line and make some huge sacrifices to be able to go to a whole new world and colonize it. That's brave. That's real bold, okay? So they started with a number of people from England here traveling on the Mayflower, which was this small ship that they used to make this journey. And they make it to the New World, and they end up having some issues that first bit. Okay, they didn't choose a good time of year, first off. Don't know why they didn't consider that before making their 2-month journey, but there it is. So they ended up arriving in the fall. Okay, and they figured, well, we could at least start carving out our own little niche here. Maybe get some land, get some wealth going on, and be able to become wealthy through the whole exchange. So they founded this site, funny enough, also called Plymouth, where Massachusetts now stands. And the specific place where, historically it's thought that they arrived was Plymouth Rock, so to speak. And they actually arrived in November. Okay. So arriving in November, you're seeing, guess what? Winter is upon us. So what are we going to do? Oh yeah, we are going to sit here and freeze to death on land in the nothing that is here, because we still have yet to build many cabins or inns or lodging areas. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. It's really cold outside, and it's only getting colder for the next few months. So what do? Well, half of them thought it'd be a great idea to stay on the ship. All right. Or actually, sorry, most of them stayed on the ship. But half of the total people who came over here ended up dying during the winter. Not only from the cold, but also other factors like disease, scurvy even, which we normally don't talk about much, but basically happens when you don't get much vitamin C, which is say you don't get much fresh fruits, so to speak, which are great sources of vitamin C. And that results in some fatigue, bleeding gums, weakness, bruise really easily, things like that. And that just multiplies your problems from there. So scurvy can definitely lead to death if you're not having a healthy diet that's well balanced. So that happened, and that claimed some lives there. Now, once it hit March, that's when most of the people, once again, who survived the winter aboard the ship, when most of the people were able to come back to shore, start establishing a real colony, and then they realized, well, we don't know much about this land. We don't know much about the plants here, the foliage, the seasons, the environment, the soil. I mean, we really don't know anything about any of this stuff. So our best option is kind of to consult the natives that are already here. Luckily, there was one native in particular that was able to communicate with the Pilgrims and help them succeed in their establishment there. His name was Squanto. Okay. And Squanto was able to teach these Pilgrims how to farm corn, catch fish, collect maple tree sap, teach them what things not to eat in the wild, what mushrooms are safe to eat and which mushrooms are not safe to eat. Same things with berries, just because it's a red berry doesn't always mean it's a good berry. You could very well end up dying from eating that berry. So just a lot of botany, and really just a lot of wilderness survivalist knowledge that this Indian Squanto was able to teach the Pilgrims and help them survive in the New World, so to speak. The other cool thing was that Squanto actually helped the Pilgrims establish a relationship with a nearby tribe, the Wampanoag tribe, which actually ended up lasting about 50 years, this positive sort of alliance between the Pilgrims and this Native American tribe. And so that's really cool, just thinking about that. The fall of that year, that's when the Pilgrims really saw their first successful corn harvest. Okay, after being taught how to cultivate corn, November of that year saw them actually seeing the first corn harvest and being like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Squanto told us exactly what to do. We did it, and look at that. We got an awesome harvest this year. So in November of 1621, we ended up having the governor of Plymouth, William Bradford, actually coordinating a feast with these Wampanoag Indians and saying, hey dudes, this is great. You guys have gotten us to survive and thrive here in the New World. Got us through our first summer and first harvest. Gosh, I really wish I could thank you guys. So he held the first Thanksgiving feast. All right. And in this feast, it was a very classical feast as we tend to think about it nowadays. In the fact it was more akin to the medieval feasts, or even some of the Greek or Roman feasts that you've heard of. To where it's not just a feast where you sit down for one day, gorge yourself and move on. This is a multi-day event. Okay, this is like some of the major techno concerts here in the U.S. It's a multi-day sort of event, and so they actually gorged themselves over a period of 3 days, where they feasted upon a variety of things. The pilgrims ended up mainly harvesting fowl, but the Indians ended up bringing 5 deer, a number of Native American dishes with certain spices and cooking methods that are distinctive for the Native Americans. So pilgrims were exposed to a wide variety of various meats and various dishes that they weren't necessarily used to seeing. And so it was really a great opportunity for Native Americans and the pilgrims to bond, so to speak. It was awesome. Now, part of the problem as far as the pilgrims' contribution to this particular venture was that still the pilgrims were trying to get established. They were still trying to get some raw materials and some industries going. So they really didn't have any of these luxuries that they enjoyed back in England. And in fact, didn't even have an oven to cook anything with. So they had to be very, very crude in some of their meal preparation methods. So it would take a little while for them to kind of catch up to the level that we are today, even in the crudest of situations. But the other thing to consider is that by that point, having been in the New World for a year, the pilgrims had actually run out of another great commodity, which we take way for granted today, which is sugar. Sugar is in abundance. It's really super cheap. You can pay for like a 2-pound bag for like $2, if that. You can get sugar at really cheap prices today. Back then, not so much, And so when we think about Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving probably kind of sucked. I'm sorry, but it probably kind of did, because the pilgrims didn't have an oven. They didn't even have sugar, both of which are used extensively in today's Thanksgiving feasts. So when you try to think back to what Thanksgiving might have been, probably not terribly awesome, alright? Because that means without sugar, you don't have pies, you don't have cakes, and you don't have desserts, basically, at all. Not really anything sweet. So, kind of sucks. Because we kind of like to finish off our Thanksgiving feast with something sweet and delicious, like maybe a nice pumpkin pie with some Cool Whip on top, or maybe even some blueberry pie with some sugar crusted on the top or whatever. Yeah, none of that in the first feast, at all. Needless to say, there ended up being a second Thanksgiving a couple years later. This was in 1623, and at that point, they were able to do a little bit more. They were starting to get more established. But it really didn't become a proclamation to have Thanksgiving in November until 1789, and that was by George Washington, funny enough. And that was where he sat down and said, well, we should have one or more days a year to ask Americans to express their gratitude for us winning the American Revolution, as well as celebrating our independence. So we're going to kind of have this feast at least once a year to kind of celebrate that. Like, alright, cool. So it was just kind of randomly thrown out there. I think George Washington was kind of a party guy, so to speak. I kind of respect him for that particular notion. Always like to have a good time myself. But really it took Abraham Lincoln to firmly set this kind of thing in stone. Alright, he's really the one who made it a national holiday. And he made it such that it's always celebrated on the last Thursday in November. And that started in 1863. So it took a long time, alright? Actually, it took about 240 years from the first Thanksgiving for it to become a national annual holiday, always celebrated on one particular date, which is kind of vaguely referred to as the last Thursday in November. Why it's Thursday, I don't know. Why we couldn't just do it Saturday when we're not really doing much, but that's what Abraham Lincoln did, so that's what we do. But what's kind of interesting is that there has been some alterations to that, or some attempts to alter that over time. We actually have FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, here in 1939, trying to proclaim that, well, we kind of need to do it the next to last Thursday in November to try to help spur retail sales. And he really did that during the Great Depression, where a lot of things changed. A lot of people were trying to do a number of different measures to boost the economy of the local area. Well, FDR tried this measure. It only lasted 2 years. It died out after 1941 and went back to being the last Thursday of the month. So that really didn't do anything. As such, we still celebrate Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of every month. Now, we try to bring this back around to what's happening nowadays. Okay, bringing it back to the present time. Now, I just celebrated Thanksgiving with my family. I thought it was a great opportunity to get the family together, have everybody bring a food item or so, and get to enjoy a number of different dishes. Nice, professionally cooked at home dishes that were relatively clean and well prepared. A lot of luxuries that were not there in the first Thanksgiving, essentially. But it makes me think about what's currently going on with a certain group of Native Americans here in America. As we do have a collection of Native Americans protesting the construction of an oil pipeline. Alright. And this oil pipeline is actually going through this area right outside of Cannonball, North Dakota, which is south central North Dakota. And it's been trying to complete its construction all the way since April of this year, actually. So it's been going on for a lot of months, alright? About 7 months by this point or so. And people have been protesting it. Obviously this is namely spurred by the Native Americans, but there have been other people kind of joining their cause and trying to support the Native Americans in their reluctance to give in to the construction of this pipeline. A couple interesting issues related to this. If you want to consider who's leading this whole revolution, so to speak, or this whole protest, it's really by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. Now we do have some Lakota Indians in there as well, but really it's the Sioux that are kind of leading this operation, so to speak. And if I can just pull up something for you real quick here, one little note that I discovered after the fact. There's this man, Robert Foolbear, who was a 54-year-old district chairman of Cannonball. And Cannonball's really the closest town to this whole event that's going on, this whole protest. And being the district chairman of the town, which granted isn't a large town, it's not even 1,000 people, but he's a little aggravated at the protesters because he knows that, for the past 2 years, they've had hearings on this whole issue. Town hearings, town meetings with the pipeline people to try to discuss this issue. And yet, the Sioux didn't seem to be interested in anything at that point. They had minimal attendance at these meetings, minimal impact. Nobody really brought up any concerns. Now all of a sudden that it's a national scale event, now he's seeing a lot of people come in and protest. And he's like, well, this is kind of stupid. What are you people doing? You didn't say anything before. Why is it all of a sudden a big issue now? So that's kind of interesting. That the man who's the district chairman of the town, who's right there, is saying, well, you guys had plenty of opportunities to voice your concerns. Because we voiced some concerns, and they actually met us halfway on some of the concerns. Like one of the concerns that was brought up during these meetings was the water supply. And so the pipeline company, who was actually run by Energy Transfer Partners, the pipeline company was actually conceding a bit. They're like, well, all right, you're concerned about the water supply. Okay, we can meet you halfway there. Your current water supply is about 20 miles from the pipeline. You think that's a little close. Okay, we'll build you a new water supply 70 miles from the pipeline. The Native Americans conceded to that idea. They were fine with it. So they signed the agreement and they moved forward. That was the concession that was made to meet the Native Americans' demands with the construction of this pipeline. So they moved forward. And then all of a sudden, once they're actually physically building this pipeline and going through these territories that have already been, that have already signed off, gotten all their permits, whatever, they've already done all this stuff, well, that's when people started paying bigger attention to it. So it's not during the planning process that this protesting happened. It was during the actual carrying through of this process. All right. And that kind of frustrates me. When people don't care so much during the planning part of things, but then they all of a sudden care when they don't like the conclusion as it's being carried out. Now we're experiencing a similar situation here in Fort Wayne as far as IPFW is concerned. IPFW is actually enacting a number of changes that will do away with a number of programs on campus, all right, including things like geography, or I think it was geography, geology, something like that, women's studies, certain philosophy programs, certain programs that are more liberal arts programs, but not necessarily the most economically feasible for the university, according to them. And it's only at this point, after the university decides to cut these programs, that people start protesting. Even though they were kind of sort of leaning to proposing these cuts 6 months ago. And maybe even further back than that. And it's frustrating to me to all of a sudden see all these protesters come out when they probably should have been protesting that long ago. But then again, it's a little trickier in this particular situation with IPFW because they actually said that they weren't going to cut programs, and then last minute they decided that yes, they were going to cut those programs. So that is a little different situation, but it is similar from the perspective that people don't tend to be paying attention to something unless it actually carries through with what it proposes to do. No difference here with this particular situation. Absolutely no difference. Now, just to give you a little bit more detail about this pipeline. All right, this pipeline is called the Dakota Access Pipeline. And it's going to be running from, from the oil fields in western North Dakota all the way down to Illinois. All right, it's going to be a 1,200-mile pipeline. It's going to cost about $3.8 billion. And it's going to transport about 4.5 or 470,000 barrels of oil per day across that distance. And just put things in perspective for you, that pipeline is about half the size, or at least will move half the amount of oil as the Keystone XL pipeline, which was just shut down last year by Obama. Alright, this was an extension to the Keystone pipeline. It was supposed to connect Alberta, Canada to Nebraska and transport 830,000 barrels of oil a day. So this particular pipeline that's being proposed will transport about half the amount of that very famous pipeline. So still a sizable amount, just maybe not quite to the scale that the Keystone XL was. But alas, here we are. Part of the Native Americans' gripe about this whole process is the fact that this pipeline is going to be running through a number of their ancestral lands. All right, they're going to have the places where their ancestors hunted, fished, were buried, artifacts that they touched, mountains that they climbed, things like that. All these things are going to be jeopardized by the construction of this pipeline. And so that's where the Native Americans are all of a sudden seeing the pipeline being built, and they're like, well wait a minute, hold on, what's going on here? Why is all of our ancestral lands, all of our sacred ancestral lands, why are all these things being attacked? And it's like, well, we already agreed to do this several months / years ago. Like, where were you guys at? We already discussed doing all this. You had your leaders and representatives approve all this. What's your problem? Where's the issue here? And so that's part of my personal problem with this whole situation, is that people were given the opportunity to speak up. And either because they were ill-informed or didn't care, they didn't speak up. That's not anyone's problem, except for the people who are griping. Okay, it's not my problem that you can't read the newspaper, or read the local town news and see if there's a meeting with the oil company about a pipeline that's going through the town. That's not my problem that you don't read that. That's your problem, buddy. Don't gripe to me that you can't read or don't choose to read. That's not my problem. What is my problem is when you start getting up and protesting something that you could have protested long ago, and when you do such a protest not so peacefully. Okay, and we'll kind of get to that here later. But just from a fundamental perspective, I have issue with this whole sacred land bit. Okay. Now, obviously there are some things that are thought to be sacred here in the United States because of some of the history that's associated with them. Whether we're talking about the presidential faces that are carved into the side of a mountain, whether we're talking about the statue of Abraham Lincoln, whether we're talking about the Washington Monument, whether we're talking about the White House, or even Arlington Cemetery. We do have some sacred places that we as an American society actually value. Even though fundamentally speaking, those places don't have any inherent value to them other than what we place or assign to them. It's just kind of interesting when you expand that to religion, or to Native American beliefs, or to Christianity, or even to Islam or Judaism or something. A lot of people praise the rock at Mecca. A lot of people praise that. And why they praise it? It's sacred to them. They feel like it has some inherent importance, even though really it's just a rock. Same thing with, Arlington Cemetery, that's just a bunch of graves. It's a bunch of graves with a bunch of gravestones. It has no inherent value at all. We could just as easily move those graves to another location. But man, would there be riots and people up in arms about that. Same thing with the White House. We don't have to have that in Washington, D.C. We could just bulldoze the whole thing and build a new one in the real Washington. Maybe put it in Seattle or something. It has no inherent value being there, but we as a society assign it some sort of value based on its historical significance. But once you start throwing religion in there, that's where it starts becoming difficult. Religion starts throwing in terms like the Holy Land, right? Which is something that we as Christians reconquered during the Crusades. The whole point of the Crusades was to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims. That was the whole point. And we did. We were successful in that. We killed many, many thousands, if not millions, of Muslims in doing that. We should feel proud of ourselves. That was great. All this death for nothing. Cool. Now, tying that back in with the Native Americans, their religion, their beliefs, assign a lot of value to things that ancestors have done, where they have been, things like that. And so that extends that to literally just about everything in the freaking world. Absolutely unbelievable. So Native American can easily make an argument for just about anything as sacred. Because they did. They did value a tree as sacred, a hill as sacred, a rock as sacred. That was just their religion. That was their belief. It was a very good way to connect them with Mother Earth, so to speak. I'm not griping about that. It's great to think that everything on Mother Earth is sacred. I think that's great. It's just, unfortunately, it's not terribly practical. You need some sort of give and take, some sort of cost-benefit analysis in there to ascertain, well, this rock really doesn't have too much significance. It's okay. We can blast open the rock. That's all right. You need some sort of give and take in there. Being like, well, we can do away with that tree. We kind of need the wood more than we need to look at the tree. That's a decision you have to make. And it's just, I'm having issue with some of these claims by Native Americans that, oh, well, my ancestors climbed that mountain. Oh, well, my ancestors drank from that stream. Okay, so did mine. What's your point? Not seeing your point, Tex. We would like to construct a pipeline, and it's going to require the destruction of some of this habitat that your ancestors walked on. It's going to. Shouldn't be a huge deal. But, alas, I divert. Getting back to the real concerns of the Native Americans, as far as the legitimate concerns that they had, really surrounded the Missouri River, and the fact that the pipeline would be going under the river. And this was approved by the Army Corps of Engineers. They were really going to be the ones in charge of that, so to speak. And they thought it was okay. You know, they've built a lot of different pipelines under rivers. There's not been a huge issue. But the Native Americans started having issues with this. And so Obama actually, just last month, put an injunction on the continued construction of the pipeline to ascertain whether the Army Corps of Engineers should bypass the river. Should try to wire the pipeline into a location that doesn't go underneath the river directly. Because if it does go underneath the river, and if it does burst or break in any way, then yes, you're right, it would contaminate everything in the river until that leak was fixed. And that would be disastrous. You're right. So that's where we are right now as far as the general situation with the pipeline. The construction has been halted, so to speak, at least until we can have further analysis of the situation. Now, looking at what's happened in other states, all right, we've actually had these energy transfer partners gain eminent domain in Iowa. All right, the state regulators or legislatures there, they actually said, okay, you know, you get to have eminent domain, so you get to put the pipeline basically wherever you want, provided you just can sell, you know, so long as you can buy off your rights to the land to the people involved and get their signatures. And so a number of farmers want out of that whole arrangement. I mean, they got thousands of dollars for the pipeline to run through their lands, and you know, they actually benefited from it. But a few of the farmers did not feel like it was a great idea, or that they were adequately given an option or consulted, and so yeah, they tried. They are taking the pipeline company to court and seeing if ETP actually violated something by trying to force their will upon the farmers, essentially. Right? So we have that whole situation going on as well, just on kind of a side note. Now, if we think about why the Keystone XL pipeline was even rejected by Obama in the first place last year, latter half of last year, it kind of came down to a number of environmental interests, which I guess the EPA was also not terribly happy with this particular Dakota Access Pipeline going underneath the Missouri River. They weren't terribly happy with that either, but surprisingly enough, a judge actually ruled that the pipeline company ETP didn't violate any rules, that the Army Corps of Engineers were doing things properly, and that construction should continue. And it wasn't until shortly after that ruling that Obama stepped into this situation with Dakota Access and said, hey, well, we need to stop things until we really in-depth analyze everything related to this whole pipeline construction process. But, I mean, the judge just ruled that nothing wrong was done. But then Obama steps in and says, no, just stop it. And so that's where we're at with that. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, they actually state that it's much safer to transport oil underground, in pipes underground, than it is to use cars, trucks, or semi-trucks, or even railroads. They state that all those other things result in a lot more accidents, a lot more oil spills, more explosions, and more deaths than just using pipelines do. And you know what? I think I actually agree with them. That seems completely logical to me, especially when you consider how many accidents there are on the road every year. Yeah, there are a bunch. It's like one of the leading causes of death among people in the United States is just vehicle accidents. It's crazy to think about. So it's no surprise to me that it's safer to transport oil underground as opposed to in the back of a semi-truck. In a trailer, so to speak. So that doesn't surprise me at all. Now, having said that, there does seem to be some limits to what this particular administration has as far as their ability to govern and actually practice their measures of safety. It seems that they only have 137 inspectors, which, if you think about how many states there are, that leaves just a little over 2 inspectors per state. That's a whole lot of pipeline to inspect. And if you really consider all the pipeline that we have here in the U.S., we actually have 2.5 million miles of pipeline here in the U.S. Alright. And if you think about how long that is, that's enough to wrap around the earth 100 times. Just with oil, just with pipelines. I should say pipeline. We're actually kind of generalizing natural gas and oil pipelines in one go here. So that's a lot of pipeline. All right, a whole lot. And these 137 people have to inspect that many, a couple million miles of pipeline. It's just not going to happen very adequately. Additionally, if we look at the types of pipelines, they're often regulated. We see that there are actually these kinds of pipelines called gathering pipelines, which basically take the input from the wells and transport that material, whether it's oil or natural gas, to the processing facility. It's what we call a gathering pipeline. It gathers from the input and takes it to the output, basically. If we just consider that, the PHSMA, or MSA I should say, actually only regulates 10% of those gathering pipelines. That leaves 200,000 miles of pipeline that is completely unregulated by them. That blows my mind. I don't even know how that happens. It just seems like they are grossly underfunded and undermanned as far as safety stuff is concerned. And we're starting to feel the effects of some of these trimming measures at the federal level, where, certain lawmakers, legislators, certain people love to see budget cuts. Because, well, that saves them money. And we have a massive deficit here in this country, so why not cut things and make them as efficient and streamlined as possible? Well, that doesn't work always the best. Okay, and so what we end up having is a situation like this where only 10% of the pipelines are actually regulated. The other 90% are not. And that just blows my mind. That's astronomical to think that can happen, here in the number one country in the world, so to speak, the United States. I don't know how we can claim to be the best when we are practicing these extremely dangerous practices of not even having people regulate these pipelines. And we've been feeling the fallout from that. If we look at the pipeline incidences between 2001 and 2014, we have seen them increase from about 350 a year, just in number of incidences, to twice that, about 700 a year. In just that 13-year period. That's pretty phenomenal. Now, granted, even though the number of incidences have increased, the good news is that the number of fatalities have actually decreased about 50%. They've gone down from about 20 a year to about 10 a year. So that's awesome. We're at least being safer about our negligence, so to speak. Number of injuries have actually decreased by 25% to 60 per year as opposed to 80. So that's kind of nice. We're being safer about our lack of maintaining these pipelines. As such, the cost of these breaks and incidences has almost tripled in that time period. In 13 years, it's gone from about 100K a year to 300K a year in costs, just to make up for the environmental damage, the injury to humans, things like that, just to compensate. It's just crazy to think about. Now, if we try to think about how the pipeline has changed in that same time period, we've gone from about 155,000 miles of pipeline to 161. That's a change of 6,000 miles of pipeline. That's not much. In fact, that's about 0.5%. Okay, something like that. Or no, not 0.5. It's about 5%. So if we think about that, that's not huge. Not a huge change in that 13-year time span. So why is it that we have now twice the number of incidences if we actually don't have that much more pipeline? Well, that comes to another issue we're going to discuss. There was actually this report in 2012 by ProPublica that stated that there are more than 50% of pipelines that were greater than 50 years old. In 2012. Okay, so over half of our pipelines are half a century old. So yeah, guess what? They're going to be breaking more. And if we total all of the damages by broken pipelines and such, in 30-year time span, in the past 30 years, we have calculated about 500 people being killed, about 4,000 people injured, and about $7 billion in damages. That's sizable. That actually is. So apparently we're not being very safe about what we're doing here. And if we look at some of the more recent pipeline spills, we have one in 2013, which happened in, guess what, North Dakota, where 865,000 gallons of oil were spilled. Now, we're talking gallons here, we're not talking about barrels. Okay, so when we talk about like 830,000 barrels of oil per day, keep in mind, 865 gallons is actually not all that bad. Okay, especially when you consider a barrel is a 55-gallon barrel that we're talking about. So it's actually not that bad. It's not saying that that thing was left open for, gushing open for several days typically. Typically these leaks are contained as quickly as possible. We try to have as little oil lost and as little environmental damage as possible, but that's still pretty sizable. That's a lot of gallons of oil. Same thing in Michigan, 2010, about 843,000 gallons were lost there, causing about $800 million in damages. So this is a legitimate concern, with the Native Americans worried that the pipeline will leak into the Missouri River and contaminate everything. Legitimate concern. So now we have all these several hundred protesters in North Dakota near Cannonball. These guys have been joined by, it's not just Native Americans, they've been joined by protesters from all over the country. In some cases even other countries have come in to support these people. And once again, one of their arguments is not only the threat to the environment and to their artifacts, it's also to one of the plus sides that the pipeline company tries to propose, which is that, hey, in the construction of this pipeline, we're going to provide 10,000 new construction jobs just to construct the pipeline. Like, yeah, that's a huge number of jobs. That's awesome. That's really a boost to the local economy. Problem is that once that's constructed, well, most of those jobs disappear. It'll maintain a few jobs just to undergo maintenance and inspection, but really most of those jobs are going to be gone. So it's a very temporary boost to the economy, with very few permanent positions. But as far as protests themselves are concerned, the police have so far arrested 575 people. They've been criticized for being overbearing and having a rough response to the protesters. And so let's just kind of break down the timeline here. All right. On September 4th, we had several hundred protesters going up against some of the security guards for Energy Transfer Partners, the pipeline company. They didn't have law enforcement there at that time, and number of protesters, in fact 30 of them were pepper sprayed. We had 6 of them being bitten by dogs, but the cops ended up coming in, breaking up the whole thing, and everybody went home and nobody was arrested at that time. The protesters, on the other hand, ended up injuring 4 security guards and 2 guard dogs during that particular clash with security. That's a problem to me. You should not be injuring security guards, much less their dogs. Okay, the dogs are just doing their jobs. Alright? And if their job was to secure that location and prevent being overrun by protesters, then they were trying to achieve that job. I do not support the hurting of dogs. Okay, and one of the things that really bugs me about this situation is I actually saw a meme the other day that was essentially calling this whole oil pipeline protest very peaceful. All the protesters are peaceful, and all of the police and National Guard coming in were just a bunch of cowards trying to play army man. That really bothered me a lot. Alright? And part of it's because of stuff like this. When I hear that protesters injured dogs, that makes me lose my mind. Alright? Not the biggest fan of dogs, but I am a huge person against animal cruelty. Alright? And so for you to sit there and claim that your protesting is unarmed, harmless, and peaceful, when you're harming dogs, that really gets under my skin in a huge way. So, just here on the first bit, on September 4th, this protest is not peaceful at all. On October 27th, we have another incident. Okay, we have hundreds of police officers, National Guard, soldiers. They were all in riot gear. They had their trucks, Humvees, things like that. And they basically charged this area where 200 protesters had camped out on private land. And by private land, I mean land owned by the oil company, Energy Transfer Partners. They ended up arresting 141 of these people, so about 2/3 of them. And people sit here and ask, well, why'd you have to do that? Well, the protesters were actually burning tires in the road. They were barricading North Dakota Highway 1806. Right, and they were doing that with scrap wood and bales of hay to barricade the road, to block it off. And in fact, at this particular encounter, there was one lady among the protesters who fired 3 shots from a .38 revolver, almost hitting a deputy. So when people try to say the protesters are unarmed, that's entirely untrue too. Because this one lady, some of the protesters are armed, and we have proof of it here. So not all of the protesters are unarmed. Most of them, sure, but some of them are armed, and we have to consider that. This is a volatile situation, absolutely. Additionally, we had a nearby person. I don't know if this is terribly relevant here, because we still don't know if this person was a protester or not. But a person near the protest was shot in the hand, and another man was arrested in connection with that. So I don't know if that was a protester being shot by a security guard or vice versa or whatever. I don't know. So I don't know if that's relevant. Additionally, at this particular encounter on October 27th, we had protesters throwing rocks and bottles at the lines of police officers and soldiers. So once again, rocks and bottles, those are weapons. That makes those protesters armed. Okay? They are not unarmed, and they are not peaceful if they're trying to harm the police forces, the law enforcement officers in that area. So guess what? They got pepper sprayed. They got rubber bullets. They got smoke grenades. That's how police respond to riot situations, to violent riot situations. And that was a violent riot. Additionally, as these protesters were retreating from the camp to a nearby bridge on the highway, they set a couple of fires, probably burning tires once again, and actually threw Molotov cocktails at the law enforcement people. So yes, they were actively trying to light officers on fire with a bottle, probably of alcohol, and a little cloth with fire on it, which is a Molotov cocktail. That's not unarmed. That's not peaceful at all. October 28th, we have the protesters burning 2 construction vehicles and blocking the road. Construction vehicles, like huge, heavy trucks, like dump trucks. Okay, they just take them from the Energy Transfer Partner Company, put them in the road, and then torch them. Okay, probably $500,000 worth of equipment torched on the road. So there you go. That's not even remotely peaceful. That's not exactly adhering to the law. That's taking somebody's property, very costly property, and igniting it and putting it on the road to block access to the road entirely. And they did that on a bridge over a small creek. On the other end of the road, they actually took an SUV from one of the security guards for ETP, and they torched it and set it on the road along with their hay bale and wooden barricade. So they now have an entire section of road blocked off at both ends. And they get to a point where they start trying to charge through police barricades that are made in opposition to those barricades. And so that actually happened on November 20th. Right. This was the incident with the water cannons during the sub-freezing weather. It was about 20 degrees or so out, Fahrenheit. and these protesters were trying to charge through the police barricades. They had set up some nice wire and concrete barricades on their edge of the road, and were trying to stop the protesters from going further up the road to where the ETP construction site was. So it was these officers and soldiers that were the last line of defense between the protesters and the actual construction company for the pipeline. And so yeah, they were holding their position. They were burrowing into their position. Which is why I was confused when I heard reports of these Native Americans griping about police officers blocking off road access to them, to the protesters, to the Native American camps. The Native Americans were griping about the police officers breaking road access to them for emergency vehicles. When in truth, it was the Native Americans and the protesters themselves who blocked off the road first. They were the ones who established that barricade. They were the ones who torched those dump trucks and torched that SUV. They blocked off the roads. So if anyone is to blame for emergency vehicles and farmers not being able to access that road, it is the Native Americans and the protesters themselves who are to blame. Absolutely. There's no question about that. At this event on November 20th, we had an incident where police had to resort to tear gas, concussion grenades, rubber bullets, and water hoses to try to push back the 400 protesters who were trying to move up and through the concrete barriers. Okay? Protesters were on the bridge. They were lighting dozens of fires. They're being very aggressive. They're actively trying to flank and attack the line of police. And so guess what? The police used water cannons to not only douse the fires, which are doing damage to the bridge. Now, Native Americans and some of the protesters claimed that the fires were lit to keep them warm. Well, probably shouldn't do that in a way that damages property, because the water hoses were then deployed to not only take out the fires, but also douse the surrounding ground so it wouldn't light on fire either. And then, of course, they did resort to the water cannons for crowd control. We had about 17 protesters being hospitalized. Some of them were treated for hypothermia. So not the most ideal situation. A lot of crazy stuff going on. Alright, definitely a developing situation, so what I've had to say has only been the tip of the iceberg. So we'll see what happens. I really hope that things work out for the better. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me here on Based on Facts. I hope that you've gained something from this particular talk. So if you'd like to hear more, you can find Based on Facts on Facebook or YouTube just by typing us in the search bar. So thank you so much for joining me, and have a great one.